Civil rights attorney Ben Crump has been demanding answers. The family's independent autopsy results were supposed to drop and give us something concrete to hold on to, some kind of direction. And while that was already sitting heavy on everybody's mind, something else happened first. Warren Hudson, the stepson of Judge Ashley Cole, the first parent to publicly step forward trying to shield these young men, he went and sat down with Officer Tatum for an interview. Now, let's be honest about what that choice tells us before we even get into a single word of what was said. Of all the people you could sit down with, of all the platforms where you could come forward and speak your truth, you choose that one. Warren hasn't been charged with anything. Nobody is saying he needs to be treated like a criminal in an interview. That's not what this is about. But when you decide to give your first public account of what happened to a young man who is dead, a young man you called your brother, the bar is not that high. You should be able to answer the hard questions. That's it. And Officer Tatum, to absolutely no one's surprise, did not ask them. What we got instead was almost casual, joking around, a light atmosphere, and a conversation about underage drinking that felt more like two guys swapping stories at a cookout than any kind of serious attempt to get to the truth. Everybody's drinking. It's the 4th of July. It's a big party. Those were the exact words. And Tatum just nodded along and said, yeah, y'all having a good time. 18-year-olds, college students, out on the island, of course. Just like anybody would imagine. Do you understand what did not get asked in that moment? Who bought the alcohol for teenagers? Who supplied it? Because if we're having an honest conversation about the environment that existed on that island that day, that is not a throwaway detail. That is a thread you pull on, unless the goal was never really to pull on threads at all. Because here is the thing that nobody seems to want to say directly. This interview did not feel like a search for truth. It felt like a pressure release valve. There has been enormous scrutiny on these young men, justified scrutiny, and this interview felt designed to let some of that pressure out without actually answering anything. And the way you can tell the difference between a truth-seeking conversation and a PR exercise is pretty simple. In one of them, someone walks away knowing more than they did before. What did we actually learn? What we did not get was any explanation of the most critical moments, what happened in those final hours, why all three boats left around the same time, what Warren knows specifically about the window of time between when Nolan was last seen and when that boat left Horn Island without him. None of that was answered. The video conveniently cuts off right as Tatum asks Warren what caused the group to leave so suddenly. Part 2, apparently, will have to wait. But let me tell you what I can't get past while we wait. Nolan Wells is dead. His mother and father, Christine and Elmore Wansley, are grieving the loss of their son, and they had to watch a YouTube interview to get any information about what happened to Nolan on that island. That is what happened here. These young men chose a content creator over a conversation with Nolan's parents. If your friend was truly like a brother to you, if you meant every word of that, then Nolan's mother would have been the first call, not a camera. And speaking of calls that should have been made, this is the point where I have to ask you something directly, because if you are watching this and you care about what happened to Nolan Wells, you need to be the kind of person who stays on this. Cases like this disappear from the public consciousness the moment the algorithm moves on. So if you believe a young man's life deserves more than a trending topic, then you already know what to do. The people who stay, the ones who keep watching and keep asking questions, those are the ones who actually matter to cases like this one. Be that person. Now back to what doesn't add up. Judge Greg Mathis laid it out plainly, and he said it in a way that cuts through everything. He was not an investigator speaking. He was a man with common sense making an obvious point. 4 people went to that island. 3 came back, and those 3 claimed that Nolan, who they called their closest friend, practically a brother, decided to stay behind on a federal barrier island with no shelter, no facilities, no phone signal, no way home. And on top of that, they left with his cell phone. His phone was in their possession. They realized it, got on the boat, started heading back toward the mainland, and kept going. An hour or 2 on a recreational boat is not a trek to the moon. You turn around, you give your friend his phone, you make sure he is okay. That's what you do when someone is actually your brother. Unless the version of events being told is not the complete version. And then there is the matter of the boats. Warren's account mentions 3 separate vessels that day. His own boat, a 22-foot Triton, and a Palm Beach 18 that Wyatt brought. But the GPS data obtained from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources only accounts for one boat's movements. One, we know from official records that the Triton left Horn Island at 4:31 in the afternoon. It returned to its primary dock. Then, and this is where it gets strange, it traveled into Fort Bayou around 5:52 p.m. and came back to the dock by 6:06 p.m. Then at 7:19 p.m., it went back to the Fort Bayou boat launch before eventually being trailered back overland to the owner's home in Biloxi. That is 2 separate trips to Fort Bayou after leaving the island in a window of roughly 3 hours. And nobody has offered a complete coherent explanation for what was happening during those trips. Warren mentions Fort Bayou in his interview, but the explanation doesn't close the loop. Who was dropped off? What was dropped off? Why does that route exist in the data if it doesn't matter? The towing situation makes even less sense when you put it under a microscope. The story told by Warren's stepmother, Judge Ashley Cole, and separately by Warren's birth mother, involves the boat taking on water, a mechanical issue, a bilge pump problem. The claim was made that the boat was towed 2.75 miles before it could operate normally again. The tow company, Seto, told NBC News directly that before any assistance could be rendered, whoever they were speaking to told them help had already been obtained and their services were no longer needed. The company says it did not end up towing that boat. Not 2.75 miles, not at all. So who towed it, or did it get towed at all? Because the GPS data shows the boat leaving Horn Island under its own coordinates and making those subsequent trips to Fort Bayou. 2 separate accounts of the same boat's condition that evening are not matching up. And when the United Cajun Navy offered to bring their search dogs to examine those 3 boats, they were denied. Brian Trasher, the Cajun Navy's vice president, was direct about what that means to a search and rescue professional. There is one substance that can clean blood off a boat. One. And if the boats were as clean as claimed, then there should have been no hesitation. You invite the dogs, you let them walk the deck, you prove what you're saying is true. Instead, the answer was, now let's talk about the autopsy, because this is where things get even more troubling from a factual standpoint. Ben Crump and the NAACP held a press conference in Chicago, and forensic pathologist Dr. Roger A. Mitchell delivered the preliminary findings from the family's independent examination. The cause of death, undetermined. The manner of death, undetermined, pending investigation. On the surface, that sounds like no new information, but what Dr. Mitchell did find matters enormously. He noted unexplained red discoloration in the soft tissue at the back of Nolan's skull. Now, a separate medical examiner not involved in the case, Dr. Kendall Von Crowns, the chief medical examiner of Tarrant County, Texas, explained that this discoloration could represent decomposition of the musculature, or it could be evidence of blunt force injury to the back of the head and neck. 2 possibilities, neither ruled out. Dr. Mitchell also flagged that pieces of Nolan's throat had been retained by the state medical examiner's office before the family's pathologist could examine the body. The independent autopsy report notes this is technically a common forensic pathology practice, but the practical effect was that Mitchell could not directly examine Wells's lungs for water intake, could not observe the stomach contents, and could not make a definitive determination about whether Nolan was conscious or unconscious when he entered the water. That is the entire crux of this case. If Nolan entered the water on his own, awake and aware, that looks one way. If he entered the water unconscious, that looks completely different, and we cannot answer that question right now. Crump himself said the family still has 7 key unanswered questions, including specifically how Nolan entered the water. What we also know from Ben Crump and confirmed through CBS News is that Nolan Wells was a strong swimmer. This was not a kid who was unfamiliar with the water. He was a wide receiver, an athlete, 6'1", physically built. His parents made clear this was someone who knew how to swim. So the framing that has existed since the beginning, that this was likely a drowning, a tragic accident, requires you to accept that a strong swimmer in familiar coastal waters on a day when there were reportedly thousands of people in that area somehow drowned and was not seen by a single soul. And then his body washed up 2 days later at the northwestern tip of Horn Island, the exact same area where the GPS records show the boats had been. No bloating consistent with 2 full days in the water, according to reports from those who observed the body early on. These details don't assemble into a clean, simple picture. And the state's official autopsy still pending. Toxicology can take weeks. We are waiting on results from the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's office that would run alongside everything the family's independent pathologist found. The official investigation has not reached a conclusion. Meanwhile, Nolan's parents buried their son. His funeral was held on July 20th at Centerpoint Church in Ocean Springs. Reverend Al Sharpton officiated. Tyler Perry was there. Both Perry and Sharpton have each contributed $50,000 to a reward fund for information leading to a conviction. That reward now sits at $125,000, and still no arrests, still no named suspects. Still, no one being held accountable for the fact that Nolan Wells went to Horn Island with 3 friends and came home in a casket. And there's one more thing that keeps coming back to me. Nolan's father, Elmore Wansley, described a moment that happened in the days after Nolan went missing, before the body was even found. He went to the house where these young men were staying looking for Nolan's car keys. He knocked on the door, and the response he got after identifying himself, after saying that Nolan was like his son and he needed those keys, was hesitation, confusion. When I don't know where the keys are from someone who claimed to love Nolan like a brother. If you love someone like a brother and that person's father is standing at your door, you don't make him wait. You tear that house apart to find those keys. You do anything he asks, because you understand the weight of what he's carrying in that moment. The fact that basic human empathy wasn't the automatic response in that situation is something that has stuck with this family and stuck with everyone watching this case closely. What makes this so hard to sit with is that we are not in a time when the tools don't exist to find answers. The GPS data exists, the tow company records exist, the boat logs exist. There were reportedly thousands of people on Horn Island that day. Somebody saw something, somebody knows something. And the longer the people closest to Nolan's final hours refuse to give their complete accounts, not to YouTube channels, but to investigators and to Nolan's family, the more the space around this story fills up with the worst possible explanations. Warren's interview told us how he met Nolan in 8th grade. It told us about McDonald's that morning. It told us about the Triton and the Palm Beach and how the boats were arranged at the dock. What it did not tell us is anything that actually matters about the hours in which Nolan Wells died. And the fact that part 2 was teased, the fact that the most important question was conveniently the last one, the answer hidden until the next episode, that should tell you everything you need to know about what this interview was really for. Here is what I believe, based entirely on what has been confirmed through official sources. Something happened on or around Horn Island on July 4th, 2026 that the full truth of has not yet been told to the public. The independent autopsy has findings that cannot be dismissed. The boat movements don't follow the narrative that's been presented. The refusal to allow search dogs access to those vessels is not the behavior of people with nothing to hide. And a mother and father who raised a strong, athletic, beloved young man are sitting in Ocean Springs, Mississippi without answers while a YouTube channel gets the interview that they should have gotten. Nolan Wells deserved better in life, and he deserves better in death. The only question now is whether the people in that investigation are going to make sure he gets it, or whether this becomes another case that fades because we stopped paying attention. If you've been following this case from the beginning and you believe it deserves to stay in the public eye until real answers come out, then you already know you need to stay locked in. Don't let the algorithm bury this. Don't let the news cycle move on. The moment the pressure drops is the moment accountability becomes optional. So stay here, stay watching, because the only thing cases like this cannot survive is silence. The next developments in this investigation are going to matter. The state toxicology results, the official autopsy findings, and whether investigators ever revisit the question of those boats and those Fort Bayou trips. Those are the dominoes, and when they fall, we will be here to break it down, every single detail, every question that still needs an answer, because Nolan's family is not going away, and neither are we.